So, brief introduction to how a lot came to be. So, Ian and I met back in, oh gosh, how long has it been, Ian? When did we meet at the theological,
E-
philosophical discussion
More
group?
than more than 10 years. I don't know. Let's call it 12 years. That's probably right.
Yeah, that's probably right. 12 years ago, we met at a philosophy club, and we became friends. But then, you went off to law school, and I was working on my writing career. And just through sort of weird divine timing and Facebook, we happened to like start talking again, and we decided to start publishing things together in, I believe that was in 2018. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
2018?
right. I mean, that's a good point. Carmen, I think of you as someone that I've been close friends with for a long time, but you're right that there was kind of a gap probably in there of a few years where we, only very peripherally were in touch. So yeah,
Yeah,
thank
I
God that
know.
did not persist.
I know. Well, you know what I think it was is I remember, we were Facebook friends, and then you posted about that you just passed the bar, I think. Maybe what it was.
Yeah, that's
And
right. I mean, the
yeah,
period where we weren't super in touch was probably I was in law school and you were in graduate school, probably.
yes, I was in grad school, that's right. And I remember I commented like, "Congrats, Ian. You're one of the smartest people I know," or something like that. And that was like, we just from there started talking. Cause I mean, Jeff and I always had said that about everyone in that group. You, Liz, and Andy, just like, whoa, these are some smart people. So wasn't
Well,
surprised that you
you've
would.
also obviously had, a tremendous intellectual evolution, as have I in a different way. But, I remember, for example, thinking in undergrad, you were certainly very inquisitive. But I remember maybe when I was in law school, I saw you posting about the Kavanaugh controversy, and
Yes.
I thought, oh, Carmen is based, actually. She's not just inquisitive, she's based. And
I'm
that,
not
I mean,
just a
that
normie.
contributed to our forming a closer working relationship.
Yes, yes, I was radicalized by Brett Kavanaugh. That was it. I was like, I can't be a normie anymore. This won't work for me. It was just too much. So, meant to be, meant to be. So, our driving motivation, Ian and I, to start writing and speaking together and doing different things is that we're both Christians, and we both, like, despite, being in two different worlds for a little while, kind of saw the same problems. Like we had a very similar point of view when it came to like culturally what is going on. And we also had very similar ideas for how Christians specifically can address these problems. And so we were like, we should team up, we should write about this and try to share some of this with other Christians who are asking the same questions and have the same desires. Um, and that brings us to today, where we're going to talk about a specific book. So just to back up a little bit, we are always recommending like books and articles and memes to each other. And this past summer, I was going through, I don't even know what to call it. I guess it was a spiritual crisis. I was just in a lot of angst over a lot of things. Kind of, it's not true to say out of nowhere, but in a few ways, it was kind of a blind side to me, which almost made it worse. But specifically, the problem of evil and some questions about free will were just kind of sending me into uh, a place where I just felt like I couldn't really get like my footing back with God. Like I've been a Christian for a long time, intellectually very convinced of many, many, many things about the Bible and Christianity, and but there was just for this period of time, just really struggling to grasp a couple things. So I was bombarding Ian, sending my various complaints about the way the universe is ordered to Ian, and asking for help. And he recommended a book to be called "How Reason Can Lead to God" by Joshua Rasmussen. Rasmussen. Um, so we're going to talk about that today. Oh, there it is. You have it. Very nice. The cover
Very well
design.
worn copy, extremely
Yes.
well worn. I mean, it's yellow
Well,
practically. I've read the heck out of this book.
so how did you discover it, Ian? How did you find this book? Obviously, you helped me discover it, but how did you find it?
Well, my story is similar to yours in some ways. I think Joshua Rasmussen, who's a Christian philosopher, I'll qualify that he's a theistic philosopher. He I discovered through our mutual friend Liz Jackson, who was in the undergraduate philosophy circle that you mentioned, and she's always been a tremendous intellectual influence on me. Was in undergrad for sure, and she produces public philosophy type content. And I think through her, I became aware of Rasmussen and the kind of similar work that he was doing. And I found him to be a compelling, engaging thinker. And this is similar to what you've said, quite twice, definitely, on two distinct occasions since I've become a Christian. I've gone through a very serious dark night of the soul. And the first time that this happened was my third year of law school. And both times I've gone through a tremendous dark night of the soul. I've ultimately reached new intellectual breakthroughs that have helped kind of evolve and develop the way that I think about God and have strengthened my faith. And in the first instance, one of the big sort of intellectual breakthroughs I had was my dark night of the soul, my just tremendous sort of sense of isolation from God and despair. It seemed internally very intellectual. It seemed like an intellectual existential crisis. But I recall one moment, and this was one of multiple things that God did to lead me out of this period. But there was one particularly important moment where I realized that this dark night of the soul I was experiencing was not intellectual, because I thought to myself, how would I react right now intellectually if Christ appeared to me bodily as clearly as any other person could stand before me and said to me, you know, Ian, I know you're struggling with this dark night of the soul. You don't need to struggle with these doubts. I want to assure you that it's all true. And I realized if that happened right now, I would 100% think that I was in a computer simulation and that someone was attempting to kind of cynically fool me for their own amusement. I would seize upon the most nihilistic explanation of the evidence that I could find. And I would not be convinced that Christianity was true by a direct bodily apparition of Christ speaking to me. And when I realized that, I thought, well, this really isn't an intellectual crisis because that's obviously completely irrational. Because what I've just realized is literally no amount of evidence would convince me of this proposition. And
Right.
that can't possibly be true. I know that's not rational. So I sort of meta rationally realized that the sense of isolation from God I was experiencing was best explained as a spiritual and emotional problem and not an intellectual one. And so I realized, next time I experienced a similar dark night of the soul, that part of what I needed was to engage with a resource or a thinker, external to my own mind, who could help me kind of deal with these fundamental questions and think about them in a cool and detached and meditative way. And I really seized upon this book by Joshua Rasmussen as something that really met this criteria and sort of helped me almost as a sort of intellectual liturgy think through these problems. I read through this book multiple times. I took a lot of notes in it. And a lot of the arguments that Rasmussen presents are arguments that I was already familiar with as someone who's studied philosophy and natural theology for a long time. But the way that Rasmussen presents them is refreshing. It helped me to reset my brain and to think about them fresh and in kind of a new, clear way. And there is also such a sincerity and a depth to the way that he writes that's very helpful. So it is for sure one of my favorite contemporary philosophy books and one of the most helpful books on natural theology written in the last 10, 20 years that I've read.
Yeah. Something, just as you're talking about it, something that I really, really appreciated as I read through it. It was almost kind of like deja vu of talking to you and Liz and Andy back when we were in that philosophy club. I was thinking through What was presented to me so often when I was in the English department is you're basically kind of told the reasonable view of the world is that God isn't there. Like, if you're being reasonable, the natural conclusion you would come to is God isn't there. And like, that isn't actually reasonable at all, but it's just so pervasive. That's what every professor is telling you. That's what every book you're reading is presenting. That's what most of your peers believe. That it's kind of easy to sort of by default start thinking like, yeah, I guess I don't have the reasonable view. I have this very, um, I'm just taking, a leap of faith. And really what this book does so well, and like you said, in a very, engaging way. You can tell this is a very smart, but also like a guy who wants to just be able to talk to anybody. He's not showing off how smart he is. He's just very reasonably, clearly walking you through like using reason, nothing beyond reason. Like we can come to the conclusion that God exists. And that was powerful to me as I read the book, but it was also powerful to me back when we were at K State and I was in that environment. And then I would go to the philosophy club, and there would be you guys talking very reasonably about why we can be Christians. And that was something I sorely needed both of those times.
Yeah, one thing about having a serious dark night of the soul that I've learned is a dark night of the soul is kind of like a razor that cuts through any natural theology or apologetics that are in any way gimmicky or kitschy or thin. And I don't just mean kind of cheap, popular level Christian apologists, but this is also true of even professional philosophers who present their case in this kind of sort of thin way that seems more oriented towards scoring rhetorical points than towards getting at the truth. And that razor just does not cut through Rasmussen's theism. It hits a
Mhm.
solid object, and you really get a sense of someone writing with depth and with empathy. I think the book is dedicated to my doubting friends, I think, and Rasmussen takes you on his own journey as someone who intellectually had this overwhelming sense that a personal God did not exist, and then sort of worked his way towards rediscovering a compelling intellectual case for theism. So it has tremendous depth. It's written with empathy, but it's also very funny. It's probably the funniest uh, you know book of analytic philosophy written in the 21st century that I've read. I cracked up multiple times reading it. So it's an all around great book. And he also, as I said, he presents arguments that I was already familiar with in a way that's refreshing. Sometimes you hear the same case made a few times and eventually it clicks when someone kind of presents it in the right way. And in particular, one area where this book was really influential for me is I was already pretty familiar with the argument for the existence of a personal God from the fact of consciousness, from the hard problem of consciousness. But something about the way that Rasmussen presents that argument, because I think it was so cool, detached, empathetic with doubts and reservations that people have, made that argument click for me in a compelling intellectual way.
Yeah, there so something I liked about it a lot is I think so I'm not a philosopher in the way that you are and Liz, and like I like listening to William Lane Craig, but there are points where I'm like I black out. Like my brain just doesn't work in the same exact way. But this particular book, it has something for any thinking person. Like if you are just curious and if you are just intellectually honest and you are interested in objectively trying to figure out what is true and how you know what is true, no matter how your mind works, I think there's something for you. But there are these parts that, where he's talking about, specifically in the book, it's called A Perfect Foundation, the chapter about having a perfect foundation. And then the next chapter is called Challenging the Bridge, where he's specifically sort of addressing this idea of, God as this perfect foundation, this moral perfection, this, all knowing, just encapsulating everything we can think of about perfection within the foundation. But then also just running right into questions of, if that is the case, if we have this perfect God, this good God, this moral God, this compassionate God, then why suffering and evil? Why are they so prevalent? He calls it, I think, the upside theory. But as a fiction writer, I mean, it was just, he was essentially describing how a good story is written. And he turned sort of that into a very powerful argument for why human beings experience the things that we do, is that we have this very, very, very good storyteller. And he's so good, we cannot possibly understand the layers of meaning that are happening at all times, but we can understand a little bit. And, he sort of makes some very good points about how are most of us um, forged into the people we really want to be. It is usually through suffering, like you were just saying, sort of those dark nights of the soul. You come out of it refreshed and a different version of yourself, more like a hero. I think, at least that has been my experience. Even though sometimes when you are really wrestling with something difficult, emotionally, spiritually, even physically, when you do overcome it, it's some of the most meaningful moments of your life. And, I don't think that that's accidental. Like, I think that points to, I mean, we all know when we read a good story, that's how it goes, right? If there's no conflict, if there's no transformation, it's not a satisfying story. So it would make perfect sense that this very, very, very good storyteller is functioning in this similar way. Um, and so I think, you know, really no matter who you are, if you're very philosophically minded, if you like numbers, if you like technicalities, it's a book that could appeal to you. Um, but even if you're just more of a person who wants to learn more about very reasonable, rational arguments for God's existence, then I think it has something for you too.
Yeah, Carmen, what you just said reminded me of how I was saying a moment ago. Rasmussen can take an argument you've heard before, but put it in a way that's new and refreshing and sort of resets your thinking about it. I remember when you and I were talking about the problem of evil, you were framing a lot of questions about the problem of evil as a mother in terms of your children. And I think I said something to you before you'd read this book along the lines of, wouldn't you be more satisfied as a mother if your kids heroically triumphed over adversity than if they were in this just sort of static state of safety where they never encountered adversity in the first place? And that did not work. You just said
Yeah.
no. I would rather they be in the state of static safety and not
Yeah.
overcome adversity. But something about the way Rasmussen put it, I think because maybe he frames it in terms of what are the properties of a good story, and does a good story have intrinsic value, and couldn't God have wanted to instantiate those values in his creation? Something about the way that he presented the case, I think, clicked much more with you than in our kind of initial discussions before you'd read the book.
That's true. And, it does bring me though to a thought that I had when you were sharing, when you were saying that, Jesus himself could have come to you and been like, Ian, it's cool. Like, here I am. And that still wouldn't have been enough. And, what's interesting is when I think about what I was going through this summer, at the time, it all felt very like, oh, it's this big block between God and I, and that I could not, you know, navigate around it. But in reality, part of me wanted that block to be there. You know what I mean? Like, there was just like, as I now have some distance from it, is I simply did not want to do some very hard things that God was asking me to do. Like, there was just going to need to be sacrifice on my part. And deep down, I didn't want to do it. And it was very interesting the length that my mind and my heart went to come up with sort of, here are all these reasons why you cannot trust God, Carmen, essentially is what was going on. But what was very interesting is when I finally, and it wasn't even really an emotional decision, it was just an intellectual decision that I came to where I said, I believe that God is real. And for that reason, I would like to do what God wants me to do. When I finally just arrived there, emotionless, or really emotionless isn't the right word, with negative emotions, but still meaning that, that is when really I could start to uh, see the truth of things. Like, to illustrate, like when you texted me that and you were saying, wouldn't you want, your children to make the right choices because of who they are, and wouldn't you want them to overcome things? And like, of course, the answer is yes. But for all these various reasons, I could say no, no, I don't want that. But when I finally stopped and gave God like a little inch to work with, it was sort of like just the light sort of flooded back in of into my eyes and into my heart and into my mind, and I could see things like clearly, like, no, I don't want this existence for them where they're just I don't know, little coddled
It,
puppies.
it's sort of like the Jordan Peterson kind of archetype of the tyrannical mother, where you like swaddle your children in bubble wrap or something for all time. But I
Yes.
have a question for you, Carmen. Speaking of
Yeah.
hard things, you specified what the most helpful part of this book was for you. I read a lot of books about philosophy. I definitely shouldn't be put in the same category as Liz Jackson, who's a professional philosopher, but I know you don't read as many, philosophy specific books. Was there any part of the book that you found not particularly accessible or relatively inaccessible?
You know, it's a good question. So as far as philosophy books go, I think it is one of the most accessible ones that I've ever read. I think anybody could read it. Just me being me, though, the way that my brain works, not being a big fan of numbers, and some of his arguments being very based off of, like, if we have step 1, then we have step 2, then we have step 3. Like, in theory, that should be easy to follow, and I'm sure for some people it probably is, but for me, the chapters that were more about, let's think about these scenarios and reason through what would God prefer, or what what could be potential negative or positive outcomes of these things. That was a lot easier for me to think through versus kind of this very step by step approach that he took with some of them. But I will say that was super, just to see someone argue for the existence of God in such a almost mathematical way. Um, I mean, it definitely got my attention. I've never seen that. I've never heard those arguments anywhere else.
Yeah, it's a good mix, I would say. There's parts of the book that are challenging that I needed to sort of slow down and take margin notes on to break down his argument. But the argument is never just pure math. He's always, when he
Right.
presents, for example, a construction problem, you can't get a first person perspective of the world out of sort of third person material properties like shapes and weights and things like that. He might give the analogy of you can't get a white floor out of brown tiles. And so he'll usually break it down for you in accessible language, but it's a workout for your mind.
Yes.
But it's a
It's a
fruitful
good way to
workout,
put it.
and
Yeah.
at a certain point with accessibility, you get diminishing returns, right? Like
Hmm.
when I meet someone who clearly has never thought about apologetics or natural theology before in their life, but they seem like they might have some sort of inherent interest in it, I might give them a copy of On Guard, William Lane Craig's book, which is like the most accessible, most entry level apologetics, natural theology book. But for someone in my position or in your position, that book, just wouldn't be advanced enough. And Craig
Hmm.
didn't intend it to be to
Right.
challenge us in a new way, or reset our thinking, or get us to go back and think from first principles. So you do need to challenge your mind, I think, to move forward in your spiritual development and your conception of God. And this book is a great way to do that.
Yeah, and one part that I really appreciated, it stuck with me. I've thought about it over and over again. And that's how you know someone's a good writer. Like he's obviously a very good philosopher, but also a very good writer. Is he was talking about it was one of the later chapters. He's running through kind of potential objections to what he's presented in the book. And one of them is, someone makes the argument for why does God make it so hard then for people to understand? Why doesn't God just make it so that all human beings, know who he is and they understand and I mean, because I had thought that too. Like I was in this place where I was like, God just like make me understand and make me want to do it and just like make me a puppet, basically. Just make me do the right things. Because I don't want to. It's like the underlying, that is the fundamental problem is I don't want to, so make me. But for in a different way, if someone's asking that question of why doesn't God just make it so that everything you need to know right away? And Rasmussen's example was that he gave the example of when he met his future wife and he knew that he liked her and he wanted to reveal to her that he liked her and to see if she liked him. And I thought that was just a very interesting picture of getting
That's
to
right. I
know
forgot
God.
all about that story.
Yeah,
What a good story. Yeah.
it is a really good story. And I mean, I'm not doing as good of a job as he did, but just sort of this like God is fundamentally, I think in this book, you see that he's this creative genius, like he's this amazing storyteller. And so it does make sense that he would reveal himself to us differently, like the journey of knowing who he is and what he is like would look different between each person and God. And I just thought, he mixed in with these very philosophical things or these really beautiful little illustrations. And I've thought about that more than once of like, all the different creative ways God has revealed to me who he is. And I'm glad that I'm not a puppet. I'm glad that I'm not a robot. I'm glad he didn't just force me to be something that I'm not. I'm glad that he has invited me to choose to be who I really want to be. And so I think, I mean, the book did what I needed it to do. So thank you, Ian, for recommending it. And this is us recommending it to everybody listening to this. Um,
Yeah, that's well put. I just finished posting kind of an updated edition of my Stasios series on Teilhard de Chardin on my Substack, and I was really getting into Teilhard around the same time I was reading this book. And Teilhard makes a similar point. He says God has given us a universe as yet unfinished, so that He can invite us on the adventure of bringing creation to its completion. And so the question we're
uh,
talking about is, if we didn't have the opportunity to participate in that adventure and that story, wouldn't something be lost? Wouldn't we be poorer for not having that opportunity?
this is a good segue. Go to Stasios, see what else we've written about. We have lots of good stuff there. Make sure you subscribe to Stasios emails, and we've got some pretty cool things coming up here in the future. Thanks so much for chatting today, Ian.
Thank you, Carmen.